Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this interesting plenary session on the third day of ERSA. So we are now all very good in dealing with these facilities, with these technologies, hopefully. I am really pleased to chair this session because we have two very good speakers. Well, first of all, very good friends, but apart from that, also very good speakers. And I'm sure we will be entertained with interesting talks. I'm going to present them, even if they don't need to be presented, because they are very well known, both of them. The first speaker is Professor Hans Westlund. He has been let's say, member of ERSA and all other associations for a long time from Sweden. And he has also taken a lot of positions, important positions around in different associations. I don't have to say much more than that, because I'm sure all of you know Hans very well, and is a very good speaker. The second one is also very well known. It's Rachel Ortega, because she has two, sorry, Ortega Argiles. Because I always call her Rachel, so I never remember her two second names. Good, so Rachel is again very well known. She has been working a lot in the field of smart specialization, policies, regional policies. So I'm sure she's also she's now located in the UK, and she will also provide us with very good talks. We have 1 hour and a half, so 45 minutes each. Of course, as usual, you have to write your questions in the chat if you like, and then I collect them, and I'll try to make a debate make the debate after that. So I don't want to lose much time in that. I'll give immediately the floor to Hans Westlund, and his talk is about post-urban regions after the pandemic, cyclical versus irreversible forces in spatial development. Thank you, Hans. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberta. I'll try to get this up. No, that didn't work. So now I should share the screen. Sorry. There we go. All right, good. Good morning, dear colleagues. Already 1963, Bob Dylan stated that the times they are changing. And this is certainly something that holds today too. Because who would believe in January that the ERSA Congress would be postponed 1 year, and that I would give this keynote speech online in my writing cabin in the wilderness and not in place in Bolzano? Well, we all hope to be there next year instead, when things have become normal again. But still, even then, I doubt that the world ever will become as usual again. And that is certainly something we as regional scientists need to consider. It's a truism to say that if we want to know where we're going, we need to know where we came from. But anyhow, it's true. So what brought us into the current wave of increasing nationalism and other reactions against free trade and international mobility, which has been drastically reinforced by the pandemic? I would say that there are interesting but also frightening similarities between our present times and the times of the beginning of the former century. To start with the pandemic theme, also 100 years ago, the world was suffering from a great pandemic. It became known as the Spanish flu, but it seems to have had its origin in an army camp in Kansas, USA. About 500 million were infected across the world, of which about 10%, that is 50 million people died. Compared with this, the death rates of the COVID-19s are very modest, although the numbers are still terrible, of course. However, in the economic history literature, it's very hard to find any claims, less even evidence, that the Spanish flu had any lasting impact on Europe's socioeconomic conditions. Other economic, political, and institutional factors were simply more important for the development. This can be seen as a possible indication on that the COVID-19 pandemic, as a single factor, might not bring any permanent effects on Europe's future. But note that I said as a single factor. The Spanish flu was not met by any close downs or closed borders. In fact, there were closed borders already when there was a war. But it doesn't cause any strong political or institutional reactions as the current pandemic has. Instead, governments did their best to silence information on the Spanish flu. So the conclusion should perhaps be that it is not the COVID-19 pandemic in itself that might cause lasting effects, but the political, institutional reactions against it. Turning over to the economy, both time periods are in the middle of a revolution of the economy. 100 years ago, it was the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and today it's the digital revolution. Then, the new industrial mass production technology boosted globalization, and so has the digital technology done now. Some people gained very much on the new technologies, but lots of people became losers, both then and now. Then, it was millions of low productive peasants and small farmers who lost their living when industrial agriculture conquered the Western world. And in the 1930s, millions of industry workers got unemployed during the financial industrial crisis. Now, there are millions of people who relied on manufacturing, who are outcompeted by global, new technology and products. So, the forces of globalization creates their counter forces. During the industrial epoch, it started with protectionism to save the farmers and industries of each country, but it ended up in a world war, even more trade restrictions, fascism, Nazism, communism, and eventually a second world war. The First World War meant a sudden death to globalization, but the end of the war did not restore the pre-war order. One of the results of the First World War in Europe was the creation of a number of new nations and 20,000 kilometers of new custom borders. International trade recovered only slightly. In fact, it was not until the 1990s that the international investments as share of GDP reached the level it had in 1913. The First War aggravated the fundamental problems rather than solving them. When the peace was re-established, the United States adopted an isolationist policy, and the conflict between Germany and the UK and France remained unsolved. And the great crisis of the 1930s was, in a way, the final proof of the consequences of economic nationalism. Now, in the digital epoch, we are fortunately not there, but there are many signs pointing in a nasty direction. Brexit, Trump, the growth of populist, nationalist, and xenophobic movements and parties, all these are signs of fear for immigration, loss of jobs, crime, change of culture, and so on, or expressed in more general terms, a fear that continued globalization will make the future worse. Thus, The trend of increasing free trade and mobility that started after 1945 and that took a giant step forward after 1989, and the trend of increasingly integrating Europe that we experienced for a couple of decades after 1989, those trends seem definitely over. This was shown very clearly when the pandemic came, and it seemed as if the European Union ceased to exist, when the national government shut the borders and sometimes not even let protective equipment reach its destinations in other countries. The pandemic and each country's reaction to it has, in a way, unintentionally become another factor contributing to nationalism, protectionism, and restricted mobility. Sooner or later, the pandemic will disappear, but will the globalization trend that we less than a decade ago thought was invincible then return in the same way that the Spanish flu did not seem to bring any permanent effects on Europe 100 years ago? I would say probably not, because there are all the other forces that counteract the returning to the trend of globalization we knew. The anti-globalization trend has much deeper causes than the pandemic. While openness versus closure can be considered some kind of long-term cyclical phenomenon, another spatial feature seems to be a more permanent trend. It's often carelessly called urbanization, but I would say that it is misleading to mix up the historical process of movement from agriculture areas to cities with the movements from small central places to bigger ones, which we today experience in large part of the developed world. The classical urbanization was in the developed world finished around 1970, but is still going on in many developing countries. But the re-urbanization that is taking place today consists of movements from small urban places to bigger ones. Moreover, as regional scientists, we also know that to a large extent, it's the functional city region, not the core of the region, the city, which is already full, that stands for the growth that often is called city growth. If we consult official statistics in many European countries, we can surprisingly find that countryside is increasing its population. But where is this growing countryside localized? Well, most often immediately outside the city borders. And similar results for the US have been found by Mark Partridge and colleagues for the post-war period. Cities' growth does not stop at the city limit. And with the strength that decreases with distance, growth of cities is the growth of functional, spatially expanding regions. So it will only be confusing to call this development for urbanization, as it is in reality a growing of multi-nuclei city regions, which also embrace large areas of countryside. As these growing city regions neither are solely urban nor solely rural regions, I have labeled them post-urban regions. Across the world, these regions have become hubs between the world market and the national markets. Ever since the 1980s, with the new digital technology and increasing globalization, there's been a growing literature on the external connections and networks of these city regions. Interestingly, it was first planners and sociologists like John Friedman, Saskia Sassen, and Manuel Castells who focused on these phenomena, and their attention was mainly on world cities like New York, London, and Tokyo. But quite soon, also the relationships between city regions at lower levels were given attention, and then often by geographers. So the seminal works of Peter Taylor, Bender Rudder on global city networks, and Alan Scott's work on global city regions have been of great importance here. The sociologists I mentioned also dealt with the internal relations of the world cities, with increasing social gaps between those who have and those who have not, to use Hemingway's expression, but they had no spatial perspective. Instead, it's mainly architects and planners like Edward Soya and his works on post-metropolitan development, and for example, Calthorpe's and Fulham's concept of the regional city that have paid attention to the spatial dimension of city regions' growth, division of activities, and internal connections. In the introductory chapter to our book, In the Post-Urban World, I and my colleague Tigran Haas summarized the predominant development trends of city regions in 4 points. The reurbanization that I've already mentioned, the densification of metropolitan areas to polycentric city regions with relatively high density all over, that Edward Soya pointed out, the region enlargement and integration of former rural areas into the city regions, and downgrading of the relations between city regions and their shrinking outer hinterlands, and the upgrading of their networks to other city regions. To these characteristics, we should of course also have mentioned the growing socioeconomic gaps within the city regions. Gaps which also have a spatial dimension, in today's Europe, most often between gentrified city centers and some wealthy suburbs on the one hand, and the poor, deprived suburbs on the other, and large middle-class areas between them, of course. What I today would like to focus on are the last 2 characteristics and how they are becoming affected by the anti-globalization forces and by the pandemic. If we start with the growing gaps within the city regions, we all know that the city centers have undergone a tremendous transformation to posh, gentrified areas of, say, lifestyle consumption and tourism. Even though the urban revival of the knowledge economy has been based on the growth of city regions, it's almost only the dense city centers that have been in focus. The anti-global trend has not had any significant impact on this, but the pandemic has clearly shown that the celebrated urban density can be a sudden deadly threat to us all. Local density facilitates the spread of a disease, and if there never ever would come a pandemic again, we wouldn't need to worry so much about this. But there will most likely come more pandemics. So a conclusion is that the urban density that we most often only stress the advantages of sometimes has severe, even deathly, disadvantages. Another thing that facilitates the dispersion of an infection is mobility. That is a very central component of today's globalization. People's mobility has increased enormously the last 2 generations, and it has changed. It has increased within the growing city regions, but at least in relative terms, it has decreased between the city regions and the outer hinterlands that steadily lose their population, even though the outer hinterlands are still areas for exploitation of natural resources. And the mobility, connections, and exchange between city regions have increased with increasing globalization and shrinking transportation costs. We thought that this development would just continue and escalate, but the measures against the spread of the pandemic have brought this characteristic of the post-urban world to an abrupt halt. We will, of course, be flying again when COVID-19 is over, but the very fact that the human mobility component of globalization is one of the main causes of the spread of pandemics means that this central element of globalization anytime can come to a sudden halt again. Also, the anti-global, nationalistic and protectionist forces exert a certain preventing influence on the international exchange between city regions. It lies in the nature of these forces to minimize immigration and to save their own jobs and industry, which ceteris paribus reduces international traveling and trade between city regions and nations. But there is still also another force of a very different kind that is working against against mobility. And I'm of course thinking on all the actions taken to reduce the global warming. As transmutation is one of the greatest sources of CO2 emissions, there are strong movements, in particular among young people, for reducing energy consumption connected to transportation. These movements contain a broad spectrum of activities, from recycling consumer products to reducing air traffic, from constructing low energy houses to consumption of locally grown food, and so on and so forth. But expressed in another way, we can say that these movements are expressions of strivings to make the big city regions more or less self-sufficient, to minimize transportation. So if these movements are successful, they will no doubt reduce international and interregional mobility and exchange, but they may, on the other hand, strengthen the diversity and the integration of each individual city region. If international mobility in train would be restricted by nationalism or environmentalism or both, what will this mean for the global networks of city regions that we usually think are the future of the world? 10 years ago, most of us would probably have said, no, these nationalists and environmentalists, they cannot succeed. The advantages of a global free market are so strong and they cannot be resisted by politicians or political movements. Today, I am not 100% sure about that. Are you? I mentioned also another type of mobility that have been increasing. That is mobility within the city regions. That has happened parallel to the enlargement of them. Improved regional passenger transportation for commuting has been a driving force behind both these interrelated processes. However, also this intra-regional mobility has been drastically cut down by the lockdowns and the downturn of the economy that followed COVID-19. Many have become unemployed, but a substantial share of the labor force have been instructed to work from home. And these instructions may very well remain till the end of this year, if not longer. So the question is, what will this huge scale experiment in working from home mean for commuting, intra-regional mobility, and regional enlargement after the pandemic? Well, just like the case of mobility and exchange between city regions, predicting what will happen within city regions can only become some kind of qualified speculation. However, from the news I've seen, it seems that working from home often has worked pretty good. Although we should, of course, not underestimate the possible problems of social isolation. Will everybody go back to daily commuting after the pandemic? I'm not so sure about that either. It may very well be the case that a large share of those today being forced to work from home will continue to work from home 1 or maybe 2 days a week also after the pandemic. For the employers, this means an opportunity to save costs by reducing office space, and for the employees, it means saved commuting time. However, working from home 1 or 2 days a week for certain employees also mean an acceptance of longer commuting times the days they go to work, if weekly commuting time does not increase. So if working from home 1 or 2 days a week becomes a more common pattern in the labor market, it could contribute to further extensions of the functional city regions. All right, the theme of this talk was cyclical versus irreversible forces in spatial development. Even if the fluctuating forces that I have been discussing here, globalization versus anti-globalization, they cannot be compared with business cycles, not even with Kondratjev's long waves, that for long has been a contested topic. There are many historical examples of that liberalization of the markets and globalization create their own counterforces. And this goes then up and down. And in contrast to these, well, we can call them super long waves or cycles, we have the very steady growth of agglomerations of human settlements and activities that we call cities, which for quite a while have developed to form dynamic, functional, multi-nuclei city regions. And in particular, during the waves of globalization, these city regions have formed and built networks and systems with each other. The COVID-19 virus is a result of the mutation of genomes that take place all the time, and this we cannot influence. But the spread of the virus is strongly affected by some of the spatial phenomena that I have discussed. Mobility and exchange between city regions and other aspects of globalization, and the agglomerations, their density and their internal mobility. Simultaneously, the measures that national and regional governments have taken against the spread of COVID-19, these measures have in turn effects on city regions' internal and external networks. If it only were the pandemic, government shutdowns and other measures to reduce the spread of the disease would hardly bring any lasting effects. But the measures coincide with an anti-global trend as well as an environmental trend, which both, but with very different aims, want to reduce international mobility and trade. It is necessary to consider the pandemic and the measures against it in this larger context. The conclusions I draw are, of course, of a very tentative nature. But it could be that we, in the light of Brexit, the overhanging US-China trade war, and many other expressions of economic and cultural nationalism, it could be that we will experience perhaps not an absolute decrease, but maybe at least a decrease in the growth of the global networks between the city regions. On the other hand, there are indications on that both the anti-global and the environmental movements, if they are successful, will reinforce the densification, integration, and enlargement of each individual city regions. So, these are indeed interesting time for regional scientists. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll put my camera on. Thank you, Hans, for this very, very interesting and sorry, there is the echo. This interesting talk, especially for giving us a little bit of a insight of what our future could be after the COVID. I totally agree that we are in front of a shock that can create structural changes in our lifestyles. We were imposed to stay at home, to change our way of cooperating, but especially our mobility was strongly affected. And this all could, as you said, take us to a new way of living, a new way of having our cities growing. And the point is here how much this will go on and for how long will be these structural changes remain as long as we are thinking or not. We have some interesting questions that I can forward to you. The first is the implications of what you said in terms of inequality between countries and regions. So all these changes that you suggested, which kind of effects will have in terms of inequalities? Especially here, the question is about inequalities between developing and developed world countries. I would also add the inequalities within and between regions. So that's the first question that I give to you for your
Okay, well, that's a very broad but also very interesting question. I mean, if we take the parallel with the industrial manufacturing period and compare it with the current growth of the knowledge economy, as I said, there are winners and losers, both in a social perspective, but also in a spatial perspective. I have recently published a chapter about the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal in a book, Great Minds in Regional Science. Gunnar Myrdal developed this theory about cumulative causation and said that the mainstream economics theories are in fact wrong when it comes to explaining regional disparities and how they develop. And even though he developed this theory, well, 70, 80 years ago almost, and he used it in his only book about regions more than 60 years ago. When I read it, I thought it was very, very actual, and it worked to explain the current situation. Then Gunnar Myrdal was really wrong when he tried to apply this at national development in South Asia, which he wrote 3-volume book and published 50 years ago, a little more. So the problem here is that Gunnar Myrdal, he believed in a welfare state, a strong state, and the knowledge economy has grown with liberalization, cut downs in the welfare state, and so on. And of course, this creates new inequalities. It's very, I mean, predicting the future is very, very hard. But if we really want to deal with inequalities, if we want to fight against them, there is also a need for regulations and welfare arrangements, not only in the national level, but at the continental level, European level, at the global level. But that is, of course, much more difficult since the institutional arrangements are not really there. That was a very general answer to this general question.
Yeah. Probably a more focused question is the following one, which I read here, is that you stress the fact that the city regions will reinforce their role in a certain sense, with the idea that people will, let's say, commute from close by because they can work at home, so they could probably go outside the cities, enjoy, and so enlarge a little bit the areas in which the city develops. So if the city regions become, let's say, a way or a more sustainable way of working and of living, does this create a sort of another, let's say, determinant for increasing disparities within regions? So the cities become more important and the rural areas lose their so the question is, city regions will reinforce the loss of cohesion in Europe or not, according to you?
Maybe. I mean, city regions today are threatening, I would say, the national solidarity or cohesion. We experience in many countries growing gaps between the growing city regions and areas, declining areas, big declining areas, not only peripheral rural areas as we have here in Scandinavia, but large part of Eastern Europe are also stagnating and decreasing former industrial areas. And that is happening also in former industrial areas, have done for a long time in Western Europe. And these decreasing disparities have been dealt with, well, in some countries they have been able to deal with them in a better way, richer countries, but poor countries have very small means really to handle this. And what happens in Europe is then the flight from many countries, countryside and old industrial areas, to the growing city regions in the West. And this is a huge problem that has not been taken so seriously by the European Union, I think. So yes, there is definitely a risk that this growth of city regions will cause greater spatial inequalities.
Thank you, Hans. Another question is related to the effect that the pandemic created on the demographic structure of population. Since many older people died, now the older people could have a different lifestyles, could be, let's say, people that will they live in collective houses or individual houses, and with what support from migrants or from families? So what will be, let's say, the effect that the COVID created on the demographic structure of the population?
Oh, this is also a very difficult question. There are some cynical people saying that those who die now, the old people, by COVID-19 should maybe have died next year of something else. In some cases that is probably right, but it's a very cynical thing to say. But we have very different arrangement in the European countries, how elderly are taken care of. In many countries, Italy and so on, it's the responsibility of the family. In then the more Nordic welfare states, it is more the responsibility of the local government to take care of elderly people. And I don't think this will change dramatically as a consequence of the pandemic. Although, not least in Sweden, there is a need to improve the care of elderly people, and well, in particular when it comes to the risk for the spread of new pandemics.
Thank you, Hans. I think then we are in a little bit of a sphere of speculation, because we cannot say that up to now how it will go. I mean, I think that this debate reminds me very much of when we started with the new ICTs, information and communication technologies. We were speaking about the death of distance and so on and so forth. And all these, let's say, scenarios, drastic scenarios, have never taken place, because the social linkages are absolutely fundamental. The social relationships are absolutely fundamental for the people. So I am, and I really hope that this scenario of having people staying at home, even for 1 or 2 days, will not take place, because that's a real loss for the way in which our societies can find the glue to remain together. So we lose the glue, the social glue that takes people together and makes people together. But we will see. Okay. So in the meantime, I thank you, Hans, for this very interesting. There is a from Evelyn. Do you think that Sorry, there are two other questions, but I think we have, well, we have a little bit of time. Let me see.
5 more minutes.
Yes, 5 more minutes. There is a question. Do you think it is a good thing for more rural areas to have an influx of urbanities? Will it result in new innovations, for example, or in culture clash? That's the first one from Evelyn. And the second one from Andres. What do you think about the question of sovereignty? Is there an opportunity to develop or to redevelop local productions?
To start with the last one, well, there is a possibility to develop local production if it is connected to the demand of the city regions, because it's in the city regions where there is money, where there is demand and so on. But local production on the remote countryside just for the few neighbors, well, that won't give much of, make much of a living. The other question was, well, spreading urbanity to the countryside. Well, that is what is happening and has been happening in many countries for quite a while, that the urban rural fringe have moved more and more out from the city centers, and that has led to development of this countryside. Development in the usual meaning of the word. Then, of course, countryside is changing. Countryside needs to change too, just as city needs to change. So we cannot hang up our views of the countryside of a countryside that was, because that will never come back.
Thank you, Hans. Okay, so I think now we can leave you. Thank you very much for your nice talk and for these provocative foresights on what our future could be after the pandemic.